What if your last regret wasn't something you did, but something you didn't do? This is the harrowing testimony of a soul who saw their own funeral, not on earth, but in the fiery depths of hell. It's a desperate plea, a stark warning, and a chilling reminder that the time for repentance and surrender to Christ's mercy is now.
You think you know regret? I saw mine manifest as an eternal funeral in hell. Every unrepented sin, every earthly desire I clung to, became a chain binding me to that horrifying spectacle. This isn't just a story. It's a raw, unfiltered account of what happens when the grace of God is ignored and the chilling reality of a life unredeemed. The rain in Seattle has a specific way of coating the glass on the 42nd floor. It does not hit with force, but slides down in thick grey sheets that blur the city into a watercolor of steel and concrete. I was staring at that grey smear against the window of our boardroom when my heart stopped. It did not explode. There was no dramatic clutching of the chest or gasping for air that would disrupt the presentation being given by my junior partner. It simply ceased. It was a mechanical failure, like a switch flipped in a breaker box, plunging a house into sudden absolute darkness. One moment I was worrying about the quarterly projections and the slight dip in our stock value, and the next moment I was gone. I need you to understand that I did not know I was dead immediately. The mind tries to rationalize the impossible, even when the impossible has already claimed you. I stood up from the mahogany table, intending to walk toward the water cooler because my throat felt suddenly dry, like I had swallowed a handful of sand. I took a step, but the room did not move with me. My body remained in the leather chair, slumped slightly to the left, eyes still fixed on the screen where a graph showed a rising red line. I looked at myself with a strange, clinical curiosity. I looked tired. I looked older than I felt. I saw the way my suit jacket bunched around the shoulders and the way my hand rested limp on the notebook. Then the screaming started. My assistant dropped her tablet, and the sound of it hitting the floor was muted, like hearing a shout from underwater. I saw them rushing to me, loosening my tie, checking for a pulse that wasn't there. I stood right beside them, shouting that I was fine, that I was standing right there, but my voice had no frequency. It generated no sound waves in that room. I was screaming into a void that swallowed every syllable. That is when the cold hit me. It wasn't the chill of a drafty room or a winter breeze. It was a sterile, absolute zero that seemed to emanate from the marrow of my spirit outward. It was the temperature of separation. I had heard Christian testimonies before. I had scrolled past videos of impactful testimonies on social media, rolling my eyes at what I thought was emotional manipulation. I dismissed stories of near-death experiences as the firing of dying neurons, a chemical light show the brain invents to soothe the panic of extinction. I was a man of logic, of numbers, of tangible assets. I did not have time for evangelical testimonies or the primitive fear of hell. I believed that when the lights went out, the show was over. I was arrogant enough to believe that my disbelief could alter the reality of the universe. I was wrong. The reality of the spiritual realm does not depend on your permission to exist. The boardroom began to fade. It didn't dissolve or disappear. It simply receded, as if the world of the living was a painting being pulled away from me. The panic that set in was primal. I tried to grab the edge of the table, to anchor myself to the world I knew, but my hands passed through the wood like it was smoke. The grey light of Seattle dimmed, replaced by a suffocating artificial twilight. The shouting of my colleagues, the frantic CPR, the arrival of the paramedics, it all became distant, like a radio playing in another room, until it was silenced completely. I was no longer in my office. I was standing in a corridor. It was narrow, with high walls that stretched up into a gloom I couldn't penetrate. The floor was tiled in a cracked, dirty checkerboard pattern, reminiscent of an abandoned hospital or a government building that had fallen into ruin. The air was thick and tasted metallic, like old pennies and sulfur. It was a smell that coated the back of my throat, nauseating and heavy. There were no windows, only a flickering, sickly yellow light that seemed to come from the walls themselves, casting long, wavering shadows that looked too sharp to be natural. I walked. I did not choose to walk. I was compelled. There was a magnetic pull, a gravity that dragged me forward. My expensive Italian loafers made no sound on the dirty tiles. I looked down at myself. I was still wearing my suit, the symbol of my status, my armor against the world. But here, in this damp yellow corridor, it felt like a costume. It felt ridiculous. The silk tie felt like a noose. The Rolex on my wrist had stopped, its hands frozen at the exact minute my heart had failed. Time had no meaning here, yet I felt the weight of eternity pressing down on my shoulders. This is where the true horror began to settle in. In the powerful testimonies I had mocked, people often spoke of a tunnel of light, a sense of peace, a greeting by loved ones. There was no light here. There was no peace. There was only a growing, gnawing dread that whispered that I had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I was alone. The silence in this corridor was heavy, expectant, as if something was holding its breath, waiting for me to realize where I was. I turned a corner and found myself facing a massive wall of glass. It was thick, reinforced, like the viewing window of an observation deck. I walked toward it, my hands trembling. I pressed my palms against the cold surface and looked down. Below me was the street outside my office building. But it wasn't the street as I knew it. The colors were drained, muted to shades of slate and charcoal. The rain was still falling, but it looked like oil, slick and heavy. I saw the ambulance parked at the curb, its lights flashing without rhythm. I saw the paramedics wheeling a gurney out of the revolving doors. On the gurney was a body bag. It was black, shiny, and zipped tight. I knew who was inside. I watched my own body being loaded into the back of the ambulance like a parcel of expired meat. I saw my business partner standing under an umbrella, looking at his phone. He wasn't crying. He wasn't mourning. He was texting. I could see the screen with a clarity that was impossible for human eyes. I saw the message he was typing. He was telling our lawyer to freeze my assets before my wife could access them. He was already maneuvering, already securing his position. A wave of rage washed over me, hot and blinding. I wanted to smash the glass. I wanted to dive down there and strangle him. I wanted to scream that I was not done, that I was still the boss, that they couldn't just erase me. But the glass did not break. It did not even vibrate. My rage was impotent here. This was the first lesson of this place. You have no power. The influence I had spent 40 years building, the reputation, the fear I instilled in my employees, it was all dust. It meant nothing. I watched the ambulance doors slam shut. The vehicle pulled away, merging into the traffic, just another piece of metal in the river of cars. I was being taken to the morgue. I was being processed. The world was moving on without a stutter. The traffic lights changed. Pedestrians opened umbrellas. The coffee shop on the corner kept serving lattes. My death was a non-event to the universe. I turned away from the glass, unable to watch anymore. The corridor stretched out behind me, endless and empty. But now, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. I heard a sound coming from deep within the shadows. It was the sound of a door opening, heavy and rusted hinges groaning against the weight of iron. Then came the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate footsteps. They didn't sound like shoes on tile. They sounded like hooves, hard and heavy, clicking with a rhythm that made my skin crawl. I backed up against the glass, my heart hammering in a chest that no longer breathed. I wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The corridor was a straight line of exposure. A figure emerged from the gloom. It was human-shaped but distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. It wore a suit similar to mine, but the fabric was rotting, hanging off its frame in tattered strips. As it got closer, I saw the face. It was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin except for a mouth that was stitched shut with thick black wire. It carried a clipboard. The figure stopped 10 feet from me. It didn't speak. It simply pointed a long grey finger down the hall toward a set of double doors I hadn't noticed before. The doors were padded, covered in dark leather, like the entrance to a theater or a cinema. Above the doors a sign flickered in neon red. It didn't say exit or auditorium. It said my name, my full name. And underneath my name, in smaller, burning letters, it read, the exhibition. I tried to refuse. I tried to stay planted against the glass. to refuse the command of this silent usher. But my legs moved on their own. It was as if my will had been severed from my body. I was a passenger in my own spirit. I walked past the creature, smelling the decay that radiated from it, a smell of wet earth and old blood. It did not touch me. It didn't have to. The authority it had over me was absolute. I walked toward the double doors. The sense of dread was now a physical weight, pressing on my lungs, crushing me from the inside out. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that what was behind those doors was worse than the death I had just experienced. I knew that the privacy I had cherished, the secrets I had kept, the double life I had led, it was all about to be violated. I reached for the handle. It was warm to the touch, vibrating slightly. I pushed the doors open and stepped through. The transition was instant. The smell of the corridor vanished, replaced by the scent of lilies and floor wax. The lighting changed from sick yellow to a soft, respectful dimness. I was standing at the back of a large room. It was carpeted in deep burgundy. Rows of wooden pews stretched out before me. At the front, bathed in a spotlight, was a casket. It was my casket, but this wasn't the morgue. This was a funeral home, and the room was full. I stood in the aisle, confused. I had just died. The ambulance had just left. How could this be happening already? Time in this place was not linear. It was fluid, warped, bending back on itself. I was witnessing an event that hadn't happened on Earth yet, but here, it was already playing out. I looked at the people in the pews. I saw my wife. She was sitting in the front row wearing black, her head bowed. I saw my children. I saw my business partners. I saw neighbors, rivals, acquaintances. It looked like the perfect send-off, a tribute to a successful man. But then I heard the sound. It started low, a ripple in the air. Laughter. I looked around, trying to find the source. The people in the pews were somber, some dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs. They weren't laughing. The sound was coming from behind me. I turned around. Behind the back row of the funeral parlor, in the shadows where the light didn't reach, there was another audience. They were not human. They were massive, hulking shapes, darker than the darkness around them. Their eyes burned like embers in ash. There were dozens of them, hundreds maybe, packed into the rear of the room, watching the funeral like it was a comedy special. They were laughing at the eulogy. A man I had known for 20 years was standing at the podium, reading from a prepared speech. He was talking about my generosity, my integrity, my commitment to the community. And every time he spoke a word of praise, the creatures in the back howled with laughter. It was a mocking, cruel sound, a sound of absolute contempt. One of the creatures, sitting closest to me, leaned forward. Its face was a landscape of scars and scales, a nightmare made flesh. It pointed a claw at the podium and whispered, its voice sounding like grinding stones. "Liar," it hissed. Then it looked at me. It looked right into my eyes, and I felt the gaze burn through the layers of my denial. "They don't know you," the demon whispered, a grin splitting its face, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "But we do. We know everything, and now we are going to watch it all together." I wanted to run. I wanted to cover my ears, but I was frozen. I was forced to take a seat in the back row, right next to the thing that smelled of sulfur and hate. The lights in the room dimmed further, leaving only the casket and a large screen above it illuminated. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't showing a montage of photos from my family vacations. It wasn't showing my graduation or my wedding. It showed a date. A specific date from 15 years ago. A date I had buried deep in my memory. A date I thought I had scrubbed from existence. The demon next to me nudged my arm with its elbow, a gesture of perverse camaraderie. "This is my favorite part," it snarled. I sat there, paralyzed by a terror that went beyond physical pain. I was about to watch the autopsy of my soul. I was about to see the things I had done in secret, broadcasted before a coliseum of demons who had been keeping score my entire life. The funeral on Earth was a lie. This theater of judgment was the only truth left, and the show was just beginning. The screen suspended above my casket was enormous, stretching across the entire width of the dark auditorium. It had a clarity that shamed the highest definition technology on Earth. It did not just show images, it projected the atmosphere, the temperature, and the unspoken tension of the room it was displaying. On that screen inside the sanctuary of the First Baptist Church where I had attended for 20 years, the service was underway. The organ music was playing, a soft, mournful tune that I'd heard a dozen times for other men. Down there on Earth, the mood was heavy with reverence. People were wiping their eyes. My wife, Sarah, was clutching a tissue, her shoulders shaking in a rhythm of genuine grief. Seeing her pain felt like a physical blow, a sharp, twisting knife in a stomach I no longer possessed. I wanted to reach through the screen, to touch her shoulder, to tell her I was sorry. But in the theater of hell, my grief was the punchline. As Sarah wept, the creature sitting directly behind me let out a sound that was half gurgle, half shriek. It leaned forward, its breath hot and smelling of spoiled meat, and whispered into my ear. "Look at her," it hissed. "She actually thinks you loved her. Isn't that adorable?" A chorus of snickers rippled through the audience of shadows. There were hundreds of them now, filling the rows behind me. They were not all the same. Some were hulking and broad, like mountains of charred muscle. Others were thin and skeletal, twitching with a nervous, insectile energy. But they all shared the same eyes that burned with a malice so ancient and so deep it felt like the weight of the ocean. On the screen, the pastor approached the pulpit. I knew him well. We played golf on Tuesdays. I had donated the funds for the new youth wing. He adjusted his glasses, looked out over the congregation, and began to speak. "We are gathered here to honor a man of faith," he began, his voice booming with practiced solemnity. "A man who walked with God in the quiet moments." The auditorium erupted. It wasn't just laughter, it was a roar of derision. The demons stomped their heavy feet on the floor, causing the entire theater to shake. They howled and slapped their knees. The creature next to me, the one with the stitched mouth, threw its head back and emitted a wheezing, high-pitched noise that sounded like steam escaping a cracked pipe. "A man of faith," one of the demons shouted from the back. "He had faith in his bank account. He had faith in his ego." "Walked with God," another mocked, mimicking the pastor's tone, but twisting it into a grotesque parody. "He walked past the poor. He walked over his employees. He walked right into the pit." The shame was scorching. It was worse than fire. On Earth, I had been an expert at managing my image. I wore the right suits, said the right blessings before dinner, and sat in the same pew every Sunday. I had constructed a fortress of respectability. Now I sat naked in the truth, watching my fortress crumble under the weight of demonic laughter. They knew. They had always known. Every time I had raised my hands in worship while plotting a hostile takeover in my mind, they had been watching. Every time I judged someone else's sin while hiding my own, they had been taking notes. The pastor continued, oblivious to the gallery of monsters mocking his words. He was a generous soul, a man who gave without expecting anything in return. The demon to my left grabbed my arm. Its grip was like a vice made of ice. "Tell us, generous soul," it sneered, its voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell us about the widow's fund. Tell us about the projected earnings you skimmed." I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move. I was bolted to the seat by my own guilt. The reference to the widow's fund hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. It was a small charity account I managed for the church. I hadn't stolen from it directly. I was too smart for that. I had simply borrowed against it, leveraged the capital for high-risk investments that paid off into my personal offshore accounts, then returned the principal before anyone noticed. I told myself it wasn't theft because I put the money back. I told myself I was a financial genius. Here there was no nuance. Here it was just theft, and the audience loved it. "He gave without expecting return," the crowd chanted in unison, a mocking liturgy. "Except for the 20% return, except for the tax write-off." The scene on the screen shifted. The pastor stepped down, and my business partner, Marcus, took the stage. Marcus looked solemn. He wore a black suit that cost more than most people's cars. He gripped the sides of the podium, looked down at my casket, and sighed. "He was more than a partner," Marcus said, his voice cracking perfectly. "He was a brother, a moral compass in a cutthroat industry." The laughter in the theater died down instantly, replaced by a low collective growl. It was a sound of anticipation. The demon next to me leaned in closer. "Watch this," it whispered. "Watch the liar speak of the dead." As Marcus spoke about my integrity, the screen suddenly split. The left side continued to show the funeral. The right side flickered and showed a different scene. It was Marcus 3 days ago in his office. He was on the phone. I could hear the conversation clearly. "Ideally, the coronary was the best thing that could have happened," Marcus was saying into the phone, swirling a glass of scotch. "The audit was starting next week. Now we pin the discrepancies on him. He can't defend himself. We frame the dead man, and we walk away clean." I stared at the screen, horror washing over me. Marcus was my friend. We had built the firm together. I had trusted him with my life. And now, before my body was even in the ground, he was setting me up to take the fall for his own embezzlement. The demons went wild. They cheered for Marcus. They applauded his betrayal. "A true brother," they screamed. "A moral compass." I felt a scream rising in my throat, a desperate plea for justice. "That's not fair," I yelled, my voice finally finding purchase in the thick air. "He's lying. He's the thief." The demon with the stitched mouth turned to me slowly. The wires holding its lips together stretched as it smiled, tearing the grey skin. "Fair?" it asked, its voice vibrating in my skull. "You think this is a court of law? You think we care who stole what? We don't care about the crime. We care about the sin. You are here because of your sin, not his. His time will come. We have a seat reserved for Marcus right there." It pointed to an empty chair in the front row, directly next to a towering beast covered in weeping sores. "But today," the demon continued, "is your day. Today is your exhibition." The split screen vanished. The funeral scene faded into the background, becoming translucent. The focus returned to me, but not the me in the casket. The screen displayed a date in bold, burning letters, November 14th, 2008. My blood, or whatever fluid now animated this spirit form, ran cold. I knew that date. I had spent 15 years trying to forget that date. I had drank expensive wine to blur the memory of that date. I had worked 80-hour weeks to drown out the silence of that date. "No," I whispered. "Please, not that. Anything but that." The audience hushed. The mockery stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the theater. This was no longer a comedy to them. This was the main event. They leaned forward, their eyes glowing brighter, hungry for the revelation of my deepest shame. The screen dissolved into a grainy, hand-held perspective. I was seeing through my own eyes 15 years ago. It was raining then, too. I was in my car, a silver sedan I had owned back before the millions started rolling in. I was parked in an alleyway behind a rundown apartment complex on the south side of the city. I could feel the leather of the steering wheel under my hands. I could smell the stale coffee in the cup holder. The sensory details were perfect, indistinguishable from reality. I was reliving it, not just watching it. I saw the door of the apartment building open. A young woman stepped out. She was 19, maybe 20. She wore a coat that was too thin for the November chill. She was holding a small bundle in her arms. It was a baby. My breath hitched. I tried to close my eyes, but in this place, you have no eyelids. You cannot look away. You are forced to witness every frame of your own history. On the screen, my younger self rolled down the window. The woman approached the car. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked terrified. "It's done," she said, her voice trembling. "My parents kicked me out. They said I have nowhere to go." My voice came from the car speakers, smooth, detached, cold. "That's unfortunate, Elena, but we discussed this. I have a career. I have a fiancé. I cannot have a scandal." "He's your son," she whispered, pulling the blanket back to reveal a sleeping infant. "Look at him. Please." The demons in the theater were silent. The air was thick with a pressure that felt like the bottom of the ocean. They were feeding on the cruelty of the moment. On the screen, I didn't look at the baby. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a white envelope. It was thick with cash, $5,000. It was all the savings I had at the time. "Take this," my younger self said, extending the envelope through the window. "Go to your aunt in Oregon. Start over, but you never call me again. You never say my name. As far as you're concerned, I don't exist. Eleanor looked at the envelope, then at me. The devastation in her eyes was absolute. She didn't take the money. I don't want your money, she said. I want a father for him. Then find one, I snapped. I threw the envelope onto the wet pavement at her feet, because it isn't me. I rolled up the window. I put the car in gear. I drove away. I watched in the rearview mirror as she stood there in the rain, the money soaking in the puddle, holding my son against her chest. The memory ended, freezing on that image of her in the rearview mirror. The theater remained silent for a heartbeat. Then, the demon next to me began to clap. A slow, rhythmic applause. "Business is business," the demon whispered, quoting a phrase I used constantly. "You traded a soul for a reputation. You traded your own blood for a clean resume." The guilt that washed over me was not just emotional, it was a physical burning. I felt the heat of the envelope in my hand. I felt the cold rain on my face. I felt the crushing weight of the abandonment. I had never known what happened to them. I never checked. I never looked back. I had successfully erased them from my life. Until now. "Where are they?" I screamed at the screen. "What happened to them?" The screen shifted again. It didn't show the funeral. It didn't show the past. It showed a cemetery. A pauper's grave. A small stone marker overgrown with weeds. Elena and child, 2009. "Car accident," the demon whispered, its voice sounding almost bored. 6 months later, hitchhiking to Oregon because the money ran out. They died in a ditch. The revelation broke me. I collapsed onto the floor of the theater, curling into a ball. I had killed them. Not with a gun, not with a knife, but with my indifference, with my ambition. I had sacrificed them on the altar of my success, and now my success was the very thing mocking me from the pews. "Murderer," a voice whispered from the darkness. "Hypocrite," another answered. "Coward," a third hissed. The voices multiplied, swirling around me, louder and louder, a cacophony of accusation. The floor beneath me began to feel hot. The burgundy carpet started to smoke. The smell of lilies vanished, replaced by the stench of burning hair and sulfur. I looked up at the screen one last time. The image of the grave faded, replaced by the live feed of my funeral. The service was ending. The pallbearers were lifting my casket. They were carrying me out of the church, into the hearse. They were taking me to the ground. But here in the theater, the floor was dissolving. The solid wooden carpet were turning into a thick black sludge. I tried to stand, but my feet were sinking. The demons in the audience stood up, not to leave, but to watch the finale. They lined the edge of the pit that was forming around me, looking down with hungry, glowing eyes. I was not going to the cemetery. I was going somewhere much deeper. The floor of the theater did not give way into a void. It became a living, hungry substance. It was thick, viscous, and black, smelling of ancient tar and stagnant water. It rose around my ankles, then my shins, binding me in place with a crushing pressure. I struggled to lift my legs, but the substance held me fast, hardening like rapid-set concrete the moment I tried to move. I was trapped in the center of the aisle, sinking by inches, while the gallery of monsters watched with a detached clinical interest. They were no longer laughing. The time for amusement had passed. Now was the time for dissection. The screen that had displayed my funeral flickered and went dark, shrinking away into the ceiling. The walls of the funeral home dissolved, peeling away like burnt paper to reveal a vast, circular chamber that looked like a surgical operating theater carved from obsidian. The light was harsh now, a blinding, sterile white that cast no shadows and offered no hiding place. I was the specimen. A figure detached itself from the ring of onlookers. It was not the demon with the stitched mouth, nor the one with the scales. This entity was tall, impossibly thin, and wore a robe that looked like it was woven from dirty bandages. Its face was a smooth porcelain mask, cracked down the center, with no eyes, only deep empty sockets that seemed to pull the light in. It did not carry a weapon. It carried a ledger, a massive, heavy book bound in something that looked disturbingly like human skin. It glided across the black sludge, hovering inches above the surface, and stopped directly in front of me. It opened the book. The pages were not made of paper. They were thin sheets of lead, etched with fire. "We have seen the great tragedy," the entity said, its voice sounding like the rustling of dry leaves in a dead forest. "We have seen the child you discarded, but the abyss is not filled only with monsters who kill. It is filled with men who think they are good." It placed a long skeletal finger on the page. "Let us examine the righteousness of the saint," it whispered. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in the center of my chest, as if a rib spreader were being cranked open. There was no blood, only a tearing sensation in the very core of my being. The entity was not cutting my body. It was opening my memory. It was bypassing the lies I told myself and exposing the raw, unfiltered intent of my heart. "I was a good man," I stammered, the defense automatic, a reflex honed over 40 years of boardroom negotiations. "I paid my taxes. I provided for my family. I went to church." The entity tilted its head. "You went to the building," it corrected. "But where was your heart?" The sensation of the rib spreader intensified, and suddenly I was no longer in the obsidian chamber. I was back in the sanctuary of First Baptist. It was a Sunday morning, 3 years ago. I was standing in my usual pew singing a hymn. My hands were raised, my eyes were closed. To anyone watching, I looked like a pillar of piety. But in this place, in the autopsy of the soul, I did not just see the memory, I felt the truth of it. I felt the boredom sitting heavy in my gut like a stone. I felt the irritation that the service was running 10 minutes long and would impact my tea time. I heard the internal monologue running beneath the hymn. I wasn't worshipping. I was calculating the net worth of the man standing 2 rows ahead of me. I was critiquing the worship leader's outfit. I was mentally drafting an email to my broker. The contrast between my outward posture of worship and the inward rot of my thoughts was nauseating. I felt the hypocrisy like a physical slime coating my skin. I was mocking God to his face, singing of his glory while worshipping my own schedule. "The lips move," the entity whispered, its voice narrating my shame. "But the heart is a tomb." The scene shifted violently. I was in my kitchen. My wife Sarah was standing by the counter. It was a Tuesday evening. She was trying to tell me about her day, about a struggle she was having with her sister. I saw myself standing there, scrolling through my phone. I nodded at the right intervals. I said, "Mm-hmm, and that's too bad." I looked engaged. But now the entity forced me to feel what Sarah felt. It was a cold, hollow ache in the chest. I felt the wall of ice I had erected between us. I felt her desperation for a single moment of genuine connection, a single look that said I saw her as a person and not just a fixture in my house. I felt her realizing, in real time, that she was alone in the marriage. I felt the words dying in her throat because she knew I wasn't listening. I had never hit my wife. I had never cheated on her, not in the physical sense. But I realized now with a crushing clarity that I had been murdering her spirit for decades. I had starved her of love while providing her with luxury. I had given her a house and withheld a home. "I didn't know," I cried out, the sludge rising to my waist. "I was tired. I was working for us." "You were working for you," the entity countered. "You loved the kingdom you built. She was just a resident." The pressure in my chest grew sharper. The ledger pages turned with the sound of grinding metal. "And the others?" the entity asked. "The ones who served you?" I was transported to a restaurant downtown. It was a power lunch. The waiter was a young man, nervous, trying too hard. He spilled a drop of water on the tablecloth near my elbow. Just a drop. I saw my reaction. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I was too refined for that. I simply looked at him. I gave him the look, the one that said he was incompetent, that he was beneath me, that he was dirt. I saw him shrink. I saw the light go out of his eyes. Then, the entity forced me into his body. I felt the panic of the waiter. I felt the weight of his student loans, the sick mother he was supporting, the fear of losing this job because of a complaint from a VIP. I felt the crushing weight of my own arrogance pressing down on his neck. I felt the shame of being looked at like an insect. I had forgotten that moment 5 minutes after it happened, but God had not forgotten. The universe records every vibration of the heart, every look of contempt, every silent judgment, every moment I elevated myself by stepping on someone else's dignity. It was all written in the book of lead and fire. You killed them, the entity said. You killed their joy. You killed their confidence. You drank their self-worth like wine. It's not a crime, I screamed, struggling against the black tar that was now compressing my ribs. Being rude isn't a sin worthy of hell. Everyone does it. Everyone is selfish sometimes. The entity leaned in close, its empty sockets inches from my face. The smell of it was like old dust in a sealed tomb. That is the great lie, it hissed. You think hell is for Hitler. You think hell is for the serial killer. Hell is for the independent. Hell is for the man who says, I am the captain of my soul. You rejected the source of life, you chose yourself, and now you have yourself, only yourself, forever. It slammed the ledger shut. The sound was like a gunshot. Unrepented, the entity pronounced. The word echoed through the chamber, vibrating against the obsidian walls. Unrepented, unrepented. I realized then the terrifying nature of my condition. It wasn't that I had made mistakes. It was that I had never, not once, truly grieved over them. I had regretted getting caught. I had regretted losing money. But I had never broken my heart over the fact that my sin offended a holy God. I had treated the blood of Jesus as a backup plan, an insurance policy I could cash in on my deathbed, assuming I would have time. I had gambled on time, and I had lost. The good man argument was ashes in my mouth. I saw myself for what I truly was, a predator in a suit, a parasite who fed on the praise of men while rotting on the inside. I was a whitewashed tomb, beautiful on the outside, but full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. The sludge was at my chest now. It was cold, so incredibly cold. It wasn't just physical matter, it was the physical manifestation of my own selfishness. I was drowning in my own ego. Please, I gasped, the air leaving my lungs. I can change. Send me back, I'll give it all away, I'll listen to her, I'll raise the boy. The entity began to float backward, fading into the white glare. The time for harvest is over, it said, its voice growing distant. The time for winnowing has begun. You built your foundation on sand and the sand has washed away. Now only the pit remains. The floor beneath the sludge gave way completely. There was no sensation of falling through air. There was no wind rushing past my ears. There was only the sensation of being swallowed. The heavy, wet darkness collapsed over my head, filling my mouth, my nose, my ears. It was a suffocating, crushing embrace. I was being pulled down, dragged by the weight of my own sins, deeper into the bowels of a place that should not exist. The clinical white light of the autopsy room vanished, replaced by a pressure that threatened to implode my spirit. I was not falling into fire. I was falling into the earth itself. I was becoming a seed planted in the soil of damnation, buried alive in a grave that had no bottom. I tried to scream, but the substance filled my throat. I tried to thrash, but the density of the darkness held me rigid. I was conscious, fully aware, and utterly helpless. I was going down, down, down into the crushing silence, where the only thing that existed was the knowledge of what I had thrown away. The little sins, the socially acceptable sins, the sins I had laughed off over drinks, they were now the millstone around my neck, dragging me into the deep. And the most terrifying realization was not the darkness itself, but the knowledge that I belonged here. I fit here. My nature, shaped by a lifetime of selfishness, was perfectly attuned to this dark, crushing gravity. I was going home. But the earth below was not cold. As I sank deeper, the temperature began to change. The cold sludge warming, not with the gentle heat of the sun, but with a radiant, piercing heat that moved through the darkness like a fever. I was approaching the core. I was approaching the place where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. I was approaching the casket of earth and fire. The descent was not like falling off a cliff. It was like being pulled through a straw. The darkness was a physical solid, a wet, coagulated night that pressed against every inch of my being. I was encased, encapsulated. I was a fossil trapped in strata of spiritual bedrock, but unlike a fossil, I was screamingly, vividly alive. The pressure was absolute. On Earth, we think of claustrophobia as being stuck in an elevator or a tight crawl space. That is nothing, that is a luxury. Here there was no space, there was no around me. The darkness was in me. It occupied the same space as my soul. It was a violation of the self so total that I could not tell where I ended and the prison began. I could not move a finger. I could not blink. I could not inhale. I was held in a state of suspended suffocation, the eternal panic of drowning without the mercy of unconsciousness. I was fully aware of the sheer tonnage of the abyss pressing down on me. It felt as though the entire crust of the earth, every mountain, every ocean, every city I had ever coveted was resting directly on my eyelids. And then the heat began. It didn't come from a flame. There were no licking tongues of fire here. The heat was in the pressure itself. It was the friction of a soul grinding against a reality it was never meant to inhabit. It started as a warmth in the marrow, then a fever, then a boiling. My blood, or the memory of my blood, felt like molten lead coursing through my veins. I was burning from the inside out. The dirt, pressing against my face, if I even had a face anymore, began to sizzle. It was heavy, like wet concrete, but it burned like ash fresh from a volcano. I could feel every grain of it searing into my skin. It was a casket of earth and fire, a burial suit tailored from pure agony. In this crushing isolation, time distorted again. I might have been there for minutes, I might have been there for 1,000 years. There was no rhythm to mark the passing of moments. There was only the now, the eternal, agonizing now of restriction. This was my specific hell. I realized it with a jolt of mental clarity that pierced the pain. In life I had hated restriction. I had hated rules. I had hated anyone telling me no. I moved where I wanted, bought what I wanted, manipulated who I wanted. I had made freedom my god, but it was a freedom defined by my own selfish will. I had stifled the Holy Spirit every time he whispered a warning. I had crushed my conscience every time it tried to speak. I had buried the truth under layers of rationalization. Now the spiritual reality was manifesting physically. I had buried the light. Now I was buried in darkness. I had restricted God's movement in my life. Now I could not move at all. The punishment was not arbitrary. It was a mirror. I was wearing my own rebellion. "Let me out!" my mind screamed, the sound echoing only in the terrified cathedral of my own skull. "I can't breathe! I can't breathe!" But there was no air to breathe. There was only the heat. Above me, I heard a sound. It was the only sound in the universe. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of dirt hitting a lid. Someone was burying me. I tried to look up to see who was wielding the shovel, but I was paralyzed. Yet, in the logic of this place, my vision expanded. I could see through the layers of burning ash. I could see the surface. Standing at the edge of my grave was not a demon. It was not a monster. It was me. It was the version of me I presented to the world. The successful businessman, the smiling churchgoer, the man in the tailored suit. He was holding a golden shovel. He looked down into the pit, his face serene, unbothered. He scooped up a pile of burning coals that looked like gold coins and threw them down onto my face. Thud. The heat flared. The weight increased. He scooped up another shovel full. This time it wasn't coins. It was awards, plaques, certificates of achievement. He threw them down. Thud. They hit me like meteors, burning with the heat of pride. He kept shoveling. He shoveled the debris of my life onto me, the secrets, the lies, the neglected relationships. The moments I chose comfort over character, he was burying me with my own choices. "Stop!" I screamed at him. "You're killing me! You're burying us!" My doppelganger paused. He leaned on the shovel, wiped a speck of dust from his lapel, and looked directly into the pit. His eyes were dead. Empty. "I am building a monument," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "And monuments require a foundation." He resumed shoveling. The pace quickened. The burning ash rained down faster and faster, filling the space, plugging my nose, sealing my eyes. The heat became unbearable. It was a pressure cooker of guilt. I was being compressed into something hard and dense. I felt like a piece of coal being crushed into a diamond of pure suffering. The agony was total. Every nerve ending was firing a signal of distress that had nowhere to go. I wanted to die. I prayed for death. I prayed for non-existence. God, just wipe me out, I pleaded. Unmake me, turn me into nothing, please, just let it end. But the soul cannot die. It is made of the breath of God. It is indestructible, and that is the terror of hell. You are an eternal being trapped in a place of destruction. You are constantly being destroyed but never finishing the process. You are forever dying, but never dead. In the midst of this crushing heat, a new sensation emerged. Thirst. It wasn't just a dry throat. It was a desiccation of the spirit. It felt as though every drop of moisture, every drop of hope, every drop of light had been evaporated from my being. I was a husk, a dry, brittle leaf in a furnace. I remembered the story of the rich man and Lazarus. I remembered him begging for a drop of water. I used to think that was a metaphor. It was not a metaphor. I would have given everything I ever owned, every stock, every property, every car, for a single drop of rain. Just one drop of cool Seattle rain, the rain I had complained about, the rain I had ignored. Water, I croaked internally. Please, water. But the dirt packed tighter, the heat spiked. And in that moment of absolute despair, trapped in the casket of earth and fire, buried by my own pride, I understood the true definition of lost. Lost isn't just misplacing your way. Lost is knowing exactly where you are and knowing you can never leave. Lost is the realization that the door is locked from the outside and you are the one who threw away the key. I was alone. The laughing demons were gone. The viewing room was gone. The audience was gone. There was just me and the weight of what I had done. The silence was louder than the screaming. It was the silence of a God who had finally given me what I asked for, a life without him. And it was heavy. It was so incredibly heavy. I was a compressed atom of misery, a singularity of pain buried under mountains of burning silence. My mind, stripped of all distractions, began to devour itself. It replayed the shovel, the dirt, the face of my own pride looking down at me. But then, the cycle broke. The suffocating rhythm of the heat was interrupted not by a relief, but by a memory so sharp it cut through the darkness like a scalpel. It wasn't a memory of my wealth. It wasn't a memory of my sins. It was something small, something I had dismissed as garbage. The crushing weight around my arms seemed to shift slightly, allowing just enough space for my spiritual hands to move. I wasn't moving physically. I was still entombed, but in this realm, thought dictates reality. I felt something in my hand. It wasn't the steering wheel of my car, it wasn't a pen. It was a piece of paper. I could feel the texture of it, cheap, slightly damp paper. The heat in the darkness flared, illuminating the object in my grip with a ghostly internal phosphorescence. It was a tract, a simple, folded piece of paper with bold red letters. I remembered the day vividly. It was 3 weeks before my death. I was walking out of Pike Place Market, dodging tourists annoyed by the crowd. I had just bought a $5 espresso and was late for a meeting. A young man, barely 20, with messy hair and a worn-out jacket, had stepped into my path. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't yell. He just held out this piece of paper. "Sir," he had said, his eyes urgent, filled with a sincerity that annoyed me. "Jesus loves you. He really does. Don't leave here without him." I had taken the paper just to make him move. I didn't look at it. I didn't read it. I walked 10 feet to the nearest trash can and dropped it in, right on top of a half-eaten sandwich. I wiped my hand on my pants, feeling dirty for having touched it. But now, in the casket of earth and fire, that piece of paper was the only thing that existed. I held it up in the crushing darkness. The words on the page began to glow, burning with a light that was painful to look at, yet I couldn't look away. "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" The letters seared into my retina. They weren't just ink, they were fire. They were the verdict. I had gained the world. I had the corner office. I had the respect. I had the portfolio. I had gained it all, and here I was, buried in ash, holding the receipt of my transaction. I had traded eternity for a vapor. I had traded the crown of life for a handful of dust that was now choking me. I threw this away, I whispered, the realization shattering what was left of my composure. I held salvation in my hand, and I threw it in the trash. The regret that washed over me was not like earthly regret. It wasn't the feeling of missing a flight or losing a wallet. It was a cosmic, nauseating sickness. It was the understanding that the bridge to safety had been right there. It hadn't been hidden. It hadn't been a riddle. It was a gift, offered freely by a kid in a ragged jacket, and I had treated it like litter. The paper in my hand began to change. The text shifted. Today is the day of salvation. It's too late, I screamed, my voice tearing through the suffocating soil. I know it's too late. Why are you showing me this now? The paper didn't burn up. It remained pristine, a stark white accusation in the filth of hell. It turned again. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I stared at the name. I am. In life, Jesus was a swear word to me. He was a historical figure, a crutch for the weak, a mascot for the Republicans or the Democrats, depending on the election cycle. He was a nuisance. But here, his name was the only reality that mattered. His name was the oxygen I didn't have. His name was the water I was dying for. His name was the door I had locked from the inside. A wave of absolute clarity crashed into me. I hadn't been sent to hell because I was a bad person compared to a murderer. I was in hell because I had rejected the rescue. I was drowning because I had slapped away the lifeguard's hand. It wasn't about the weight of my sin. It was about the absence of the Savior. Jesus! I screamed. It wasn't a curse this time. It was a cry. It was a roar. It was the first honest prayer I had ever prayed in my existence. Jesus, I was wrong. I was so wrong. The dirt around me seemed to vibrate with the sound of his name. The demons didn't like that name. The darkness didn't like that name. The pressure increased, trying to crush the confession out of me, trying to silence the one word that had power in this place. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The mask was gone. The businessman was dead. The pride was ash. There was only a naked, terrified soul, realizing that he had missed the most important appointment of his existence. I didn't listen, I sobbed, tears that evaporated instantly hissing on my cheeks. I didn't care. I thought I had time. I thought I was in control. The tract in my hand dissolved into light, pure, blinding white light. It wasn't the sickly yellow of the corridor or the sterile white of the autopsy room. This was living light. It didn't illuminate the darkness. It obliterated it. I looked at the light, and for a split second I saw him. I didn't see a face. I saw a presence. I saw a hand, scarred and open, reaching down through the layers of earth, through the roof of the theater, through the glass wall, through the pride, through the sin. It was a vision of what could have been. It was the memory of the grace I had scorned. Lord, I screamed, the word ripping from the bottom of my soul. I acknowledge you. You are Lord. You are God. I am nothing. I am dust. Save me, please. If there is any mercy left in the universe, save me. I wasn't asking to go back to my life. I wasn't asking for my money. I just wanted him. I just wanted to be near that light. I wanted the separation to end. I would have gladly scrubbed the floors of heaven for eternity just to be out of this crushing absence. The vibration in the dirt turned into a quake. The casket of earth and fire began to crack. The heavy silence was shattered by a sound like thunder, like the stone rolling away from a tomb. My scream merged with the thunder. I was declaring his lordship not as a ritual, but as a drowning man clutches a rope. I surrendered. I gave up. I let go of the I that had led me here. Jesus! The name tore the darkness apart. The darkness did not fade. It shattered. One moment, I was a fossilized soul trapped under the weight of the earth, screaming the name of the one I had rejected. The next, the crushing gravity inverted. It was violent, nauseating, and instantaneous. I wasn't falling anymore. I was being ripped upward. It felt as though a giant hand had reached into the bedrock of hell, grabbed me by the scruff of my spirit, and yanked me back toward the surface with the velocity of a rocket. I tore through layers of shadow, through the sticky tar of the theater, through the cold glass of the viewing room. The sensations blurred into a kaleidoscope of pain and speed. I felt the cold wind of the void rushing past me, stripping away the ash and the heat. The silence of the grave was replaced by a deafening roar, like a jet engine screaming inside my ears. Then came the impact. It wasn't a soft landing. It was a collision. I felt my soul slam into something heavy, cold, and stiff. It was like diving into a suit of frozen armor that was 2 sizes too small. The shock of re-entry was worse than the initial death. It was a jolt of electricity that fired every dormant nerve ending at once. My eyes snapped open. Light, blinding, fluorescent, humming light. I gasped, a desperate, ragged inhale that felt like sucking broken glass into my lungs. My chest heaved, cracking the stiffness of rigor that had begun to set in. The sound that came out of me was a guttural, animalistic howl of terror and shock. "Jesus!" I screamed, the name still on my lips from the pit. There was a crash. A metal tray hit the floor, scattering instruments everywhere. I tried to sit up, but my body was sluggish, heavy, resisting my commands. I was shivering violently, my teeth chattering with a sound that echoed in the small, tiled room. I wasn't in my office. I wasn't in the boardroom. I was on a steel table. I was naked, covered by a thin white sheet. A young man in green scrubs was pressed against the far wall, his face drained of all blood, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He was trembling so hard he could barely stand. He had been preparing to tag me. "Stay back!" he stammered, holding up a clipboard as a shield. You were dead. No pulse, no rhythm. You were cold." I looked at my hands. They were pale, blue-tinged, the fingernails purple. But they were moving. I flexed my fingers, watching the tendons shift under the skin. I was back. I was in the body. The heat of hell was gone, replaced by the biting chill of the hospital morgue. I slid off the table, my legs buckling under me. I hit the floor hard, but I didn't care. The pain of the impact was sweet. It was real, it was earthly pain, not spiritual torment. I pressed my cheek against the cold tiles, weeping uncontrollably. I touched the grout lines. I touched the metal leg of the table. Matter. Solid, cool, redeemable matter. "I'm alive," I sobbed, the words choking out between gasps. "Oh God, I'm alive." The orderly was shouting for help now, fumbling with the wall phone, but I barely heard him. I was busy breathing. In, out, in, out. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor cleaner, and it was the sweetest perfume I had ever encountered. It wasn't sulfur, it wasn't rot. It was the smell of a second chance. Doctors rushed in. Confusion, chaos. Someone wrapped a warm blanket around me. Someone shone a light in my eyes. They were asking questions. What happened? How do you feel? Do you know your name? I looked at the lead doctor, a gray-haired man who looked like he had seen everything. He looked shaken. "My name," I whispered, my voice raspy and weak, "is not important, but I know where I was going, and I know who brought me back." They transferred me to the ICU. My wife, Sarah, arrived an hour later. She walked into the room tentatively, her face swollen from crying, dressed in the black clothes she had been wearing to plan my funeral. When she saw me sitting up, sipping water, she didn't run to me. She froze in the doorway, looking at me like I was a ghost, and in a way I was. The man she knew, the arrogant, dismissive, selfish executive, had died in that high-rise. He was still buried in the pit. The man sitting in the hospital bed was someone else entirely. "Sarah," I said. The tone of my voice stopped her. It wasn't the commanding bark she was used to. It was broken, soft. I motioned for her to come closer. She approached the bed slowly. I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was warm, living. I held it like it was the most precious object in the universe. I looked into her eyes, really looked at her, for the first time in 20 years. "I'm sorry," I said. It wasn't a casual apology. It was a confession. I started to cry again, hot tears streaming down my face, wetting her hand. "I'm sorry for everything," I choked out. "For the neglect, for the silence, for making you feel alone in your own house. I saw it, Sarah. I saw what I did to you. I was a monster." She stared at me, shock giving way to a dawning realization that this wasn't a temporary delirium. She squeezed my hand back, tears filling her own eyes. "What happened to you?" she whispered. "I died," I told her, looking straight into her soul. "And I went to the place I belonged. I saw the funeral, Sarah. I saw the demons laughing at the eulogy. I saw the lies. I spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors called it a Lazarus phenomenon, a spontaneous return of circulation after failed resuscitation. They had scientific terms for it. They talked about delayed chemical reactions and misdiagnosed death. I let them talk. I knew the truth. When I was discharged, I didn't go back to the office. I had my lawyer draft a resignation letter. I liquidated my shares. The widow's fund I had abused. I repaid it tenfold, anonymously. The young waiter I had humiliated, I found him, apologized to his face, and paid off his student loans. But the hardest part was the living room. A week after my return, I gathered my family. Sarah, my 2 teenage children, and even Marcus, my business partner. Marcus looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room, wondering if I remembered the phone call I had seen on the screen in hell. I stood before them, not as the patriarch, but as a penitent. "I have to tell you something," I began, my voice steady but quiet. "The man you knew is dead. He died in that office. God, in his infinite mercy, decided to send someone else back in his body." I looked at Marcus. "I know about the audit, Marcus. I know about the plan to frame me." Marcus went pale, opening his mouth to deny it. "Don't," I said, raising a hand. "I'm not going to sue you. I'm not going to call the police. I'm forgiving you, because where I was, there is no forgiveness, and I never want to go back there." I turned to my children. "I chased the world," I told them. "I wanted to give you everything money could buy, and I forgot to give you a father who knew God. I'm sorry. That changes today." I pulled the Bible out of my pocket, a small worn one I had bought from a bookstore on the way home from the hospital. "This is the only map that matters," I said. "I was buried under the weight of my own life because I didn't have this. I was building on sand. My life now is smaller. We live in a modest house. I don't wear Italian suits. I drive a used truck. But every morning when I wake up and see the gray Seattle rain against the window, I don't see gloom. I see grace. I see another day that I didn't earn, another chance to get it right. I still have nightmares sometimes. I dream of the heat, the pressure, the sound of the dirt hitting the lid. I wake up gasping, reaching for the light. But then I remember the hand that pulled me out. I remember the name that shattered the darkness. Hell is real. I have walked its corridors. I have sat in its theater. I have felt its soil in my lungs. Do not let your pride be the shovel that buries you. Do not let the good life cost you your soul. The exit door is open. The hand is reaching down. But you have to take it before the screen goes dark, because next time, the movie won't end. Thank you for reading this testimony. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Help us share these powerful encounters with the world.